Okay, I think we are live. Hey, everybody, it's Uncle Grumpy, and welcome to Grumpy Tonight. Give me just a minute here before we start getting more sounds than we're supposed to, like usual. As you can see, tonight we're here with Lawrence Pasternack. Lawrence, how you doing?
I'm all right, a little tired. I think I'm sort of in the lull of the summer, about a month until semester starts. And so I'm going to have to start kind of focusing on that soon. But I've been kind of
Remind everybody, if you don't mind, because I think it's important. When you say semester starts, tell everybody what you do, those that maybe don't know.
I am the director of religious studies at Oklahoma State University. Professor in the philosophy department there for about 23. This will be my 24th year. And I became the director of religious studies about 2 years ago.
Yeah, your workload certainly picked up. We've been working together for just a little over 2 years now, I think. So
Yeah.
I remember when you got that job. I remember what a big deal that was. That was exciting.
Yeah, I've really been a research focused faculty member most of my time there, and probably well, you of course know, a lot of other people know that I have scoliosis and chronic pain from it, and so I used to spend 10, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, sitting at my computer writing journal articles and books, and it just got more and more painful. And so I decided that I had to scale back some of the writing and wanted to do something other than that. And um, basically was offered and accepted the directorship for religious studies.
Okay, everybody that's watching, first, thanks for joining us. And if you don't mind, please share. I've shared to a couple of our pages. I'll probably drop it in a few as we go along. But if you guys can help get this out. And let me check. We seem to have this problem where it frequently starts off fine and then it starts only going to my friends. Yep, that's where it's at right now. Okay, folks, for those that were wondering what's going on, it's now been fixed. Just had to change it back, Lawrence. You saw me set it up, and we set it up.
I don't know why it flips back
with the public, and when it goes back, it goes private or to friends only. So if anybody's having trouble seeing it, you should be able to see it now. It's viewable to public. Yeah. So hopefully they can see it. Again, please share it to your room so everybody else can see it. All right. Well, tonight we want to just kind of take a broad look at what's going on federally. It's something I don't normally concentrate on much. The reason I see it is, at least for the amount of years that I've been working as an activist, just for a few years now, I've never really believed that the federal government was anywhere close to doing anything. So I never concerned myself much with what they were going to do and how that might affect the state. But I think even for non-believers like me, it's starting to become more and more obvious that something is going to happen. And I say that the way I've always said it is, it will happen as soon as those that are against it now, those that still find the moral objection or like what we in this community like to call reefer madness, when those that have reefer madness figure out the right way to profit from it, then I believe it will move forward. And I hate to be so negative about it, but I don't think reefer madness is real anymore. I think it's a front for people who need a bigger check to do the right thing. So for me, it's odd for me to feel like the federal government might do something, but as we're going to look at tonight, they are discussing it. And again, it's all about the dollars. So Lawrence, before we do that, something happened today that I think we should address first. And that was somebody had trouble looking up a bill and you explained it to them. So why don't we start by you taking a few minutes to explain that, in case anybody wants to look up a bill that we bring up during the show, they'll know how to bring it up properly. They'll know how to look it up properly so they can follow along. So why don't you go ahead and take over?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I see Pamela and Raymond Storm having commented. If anybody has any questions or any sort of topics they'd like us to discuss, put it in the comments. I'll keep my eye on it, and we'll deal with it. But just I wanted to take a minute because this is something that happens fairly often on Facebook. That people are trying to track down a bill and get confused between different versions of the bill. And today there happened to just be a discussion that I caught and just help somebody out with regards to where to find the bills and which version of a bill is the one that you should be looking at ultimately. So let me just do this screen share. Here it is. And just sort of a quick thing, there are a few different ways, there are a few different websites that you can go to. There's something called Legiscan, but I usually go to oklegislature.gov. So if you're looking for the version of a bill during the legislative session or after the legislative session, then this is sort of one of the easiest ways to find it. So oklegislature.gov. You'll have to know the bill number, either that or you're going to have to search in statutes for keywords. So I'm not going to show you how to search for keywords, but there's a way of doing it. If you don't know the bill number, you type in marijuana in the keyword search, you can come up with it. But let's say, for instance, you wanted to see what's going on with Senate Bill 1033, which is one of the marijuana bills for this session. So under find legislation, you type in SB 1033 and you hit search. And what it'll take you first to is the history of all the actions that took place with respect to that bill. The first reading, all the various amendments, committee events, and so on and so forth, ultimately in this case to it getting approved by the governor. If you want to look at the versions of the bill, you hit versions. And so the version that it was introduced, the various committee versions of it, the versions that are read on the floor of the Senate, on the floor of the House. And then there's the engrossed version. And the engrossed version is when one chamber approves it and then is ready to transfer it over to the other chamber. And so after the engrossed version, you'll get, say, here we see an amended and engrossed. And so they'll have basically the engrossed version from the first chamber, and then the amended version from the chamber where it's currently being debated. And then that one gets filed for a conference committee reconciliation, in this case at least. So there's a conference committee reconciliation. And the final version of the bill is called the enrolled version because it gets enrolled into state law, all right? So the enrolled version is the version that has all the signatures on it. And so by the time you get to the end of the legislative session, assuming that the bill has made it all the way through the system, you'll have the enrolled version. And so you could then select the enrolled version and it'll just come up as a PDF. And then obviously you could read it, you can do a keyword search for it and so on. So it really isn't too complicated, but a common mistake that people make is they don't know what version to look at. And so normally what you'll do is when you click versions, you'll just go to the last version chronologically, the most recent version chronologically. During the legislative session, you'll do that. And then once the legislative session is over, go to the enrolled version, assuming, of course, it made it through both chambers and gets approved by the governor. Not a lot to it, but because we have so many different changes that go on, people sometimes might think an early version of the bill is the one that became law. And those bills go through so many changes, the final version might look nothing like the introduced version. So that is just an issue that came up today on Facebook. And so many people want to keep track of things. This is just a little bit to help you go through it. Pamela says, I thought this was federal. Yeah, Pamela, we're going to get to that in just a minute. I just wanted to go over how to get through the website for state bills to start out with. Okay, stop share. Okay, that was my little lesson on how to find bills.
All right, well, I'm sharing this to a few people so we can get some more of our good friends in here. I've seen a lot of them are jumping in already.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining, folks. Please share.
And let me screen share one more thing. This is kind of the segue then to some federal issues. There's a variety of different news services out there pertaining to marijuana on the web. But, you know, honestly, I check this most days. I just do a little quick glance at this website to see what's going on. I really like it. It's called marijuanamoment.net. And so it really is an excellent website that keeps track of day by day what the issues are going on federally and in each state. So the people running this are doing an amazing job. Tons of information all the way through, not just with marijuana. Here you can see something related to psilocybin. There's state issues down at the bottom, and then up at the top, usually you'll have sort of the key federal moments. It's really an excellent website. You just keep track of the daily news.
Okay. All right. I think I've shared it just about enough. All right. So we've seen how to look up a bill. That's just in case we talk about a bill tonight or any other night. You guys want to follow along with the bill, you'll be able to find it. If you have any more questions about that, just let us know and we'll address it. So Lawrence, let's take a look. What we talked about earlier today in getting ready to do this was we talked about a few things, but we talked about some possible changes that the federal government is looking at making. Now, this is a proposed bill they have, if I'm not mistaken. This has not been put up for a vote or anything like that yet. So, and we got to be realistic, the chances of it passing, while, like I said at the beginning, maybe greater than they used to be, they're still pretty on the fence. So would you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Just as a little bit of background, for the last 3 or 4 years, there have been various bills that have been introduced, many of which never made it through committee, to revise the federal status of cannabis. Last year, something important happened, which is something called the MORE Act actually got to a vote in the US House of Representatives and passed the US House of Representatives. But Mitch McConnell, who was then in control of the US Senate, would not bring it up for a vote on the Senate side, and so it died. But nevertheless, the MORE Act was the first act that made it to a vote and passed on the House side. Now, what we're looking at this year is something called the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act that's being introduced on the Senate side. And so probably just about everybody here knows that the Democrats control both the Senate and the House. So in theory, marijuana reform could move forward because the Democrats support legalization. However, in order for a bill to get to a vote in the Senate, a debate has to end. And there is something called the filibuster rule, which basically allows a party to continue debate indefinitely unless that debate comes to an end by a vote of 60, a 60-person vote. So in order for a bill to get to a final vote in the Senate, they have to end debate, and that requires a vote of 60 persons. So that basically means that if the majority has 52 people, then you have to find 8 people from the minority party to go along with it to even get to a vote. So what we're probably going to face with regards to federal legalization is that even if they have the votes, more than 50 votes for it to pass, they probably don't have the 60 votes needed to actually end a filibuster on it and bring it to a vote. The alternative scenario is that cannabis can be removed from Schedule 1 without an act of Congress. What could happen is that the president could instruct the Secretary of Health and Human Services to basically conduct an inquiry about changing the status of something on the Controlled Substances Act. If they have support for it from Health and Human Services, then it goes over to the Department of Justice. And then the Department of Justice then could direct that that be removed or changed in its place in the Controlled Substances Act. So one possibility is that if the filibuster comes up and they can't get this to a vote, Biden can basically play out this game saying to the Republicans, if you guys don't end the filibuster, then I'm just going to administratively legalize it anyhow.
Okay,
in theory, that could happen.
Yeah, but let me interrupt you here. Let's address that. That goes to what I was saying earlier. It's all about the money. He could do that, but would that not just that wouldn't guarantee them any money? That would just end the 280E, which is where the government is profiting from something they still continue to keep illegal, in a huge way. The largest thing to overcome in the cannabis industry for all of these businesses in Oklahoma is that 280E. They have to be able to somehow deduct things that they can't deduct because it's federally illegal. So if they were to just deschedule, that doesn't set up the framework for them, because that would eliminate the 280E.
Right.
Because the 280E is for any illegal substance. Okay.
Right.
You can do 280E on cocaine, whatever. That's what it's for. It's for illegal things that are illegal. So for them to not lose out on any money, I see just rescheduling and dropping the 280 as them losing out on that money. I'll bring that home by saying in the conversations others have been having and that have been going on about petitions, one of the things that has been addressed has been how fast, if we go to like full access and we drop the medical tax, how fast we can do that, because we don't want the state to take too big of a loss in the money, because it matters. So I say, in the same sense, in a larger scale, the federal government or Biden is not going to reschedule without first having that layout that gives them the opportunity to not miss out on a dime of what they're currently collecting.
Yeah, it's kind of like a bluff or a gambit or something like that. That in the situation where if there's a filibuster, the White House could say, look, we support a change to federal law, and if Congress won't do it, we might do it administratively. Now, what they could do administratively is they could move it just from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2, which we'll just put in the same category as cocaine and methamphetamine. Cocaine and methamphetamine are Schedule 2. So, that won't get rid of 280E, but what it will mean is that cannabis in theory could be prescribed, and it'll mean that there could be more access to research on it. So given Biden's, conservative approach to all this, he was one of the Democrat architects on the war on drugs, that maybe what Biden might do at best is just move from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2. It's hard to say how this will play out. Just, there's just lots of possibilities. Okay. Nevertheless,
let's go ahead, finish.
Yeah, as I say, nevertheless, something is afoot, right? Something is afoot, right? This is not done with, think about the hundreds of hours it takes to put together 163-page legislation.
That's what I was getting ready to ask you about. Let me jump in here. This is 63 pages you just said of legislation. And Lawrence, you've been nice enough while I was driving home today to skim over all of it. So let's take a look at that. And let's start by addressing what I brought up right here with the money. So how would they replace the 280E money in this particular idea? What do you see?
So let me do another screen share. And like I said, it's 163 pages, and basically about an hour before Grumpy tonight, I went to it for the first time. So I gave myself just, I probably read it through for about 30 minutes. I don't obviously have all the details and all the ins and outs, but this is a summary, nevertheless, of that. And on Chris's page for the show tonight, I provided a link to this Cannabis Administration and Opportunities Act, as well as a 30-page summary document that they also prepared. So I could probably find it and put it in the notes for the comment section. But let me basically run through these 15 or so key highlights. What this act would do, which so far is just a draft. It hasn't even been technically introduced yet into Congress. It's just a discussion draft with the idea, I suppose, that they will introduce it in the coming months. But it will remove cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act. It will make that removal retroactive, so that people who have federal offenses related to marijuana could get those federal offenses expunged. People who are in prison for those federal offenses could have their sentences reduced or revoked. And so it will involve potentially people getting released from jail. This is at the federal level, not state charges, but federal charges. It still makes it allowable for federal employees to be tested for THC. So, Department of Transportation or, NASA or whatever, they could still test people if they so chose. It'll move cannabis out of the Drug Enforcement Agency and put it into other agencies, a variety of other agencies, depending upon the issue. The ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, will include cannabis. It doesn't legalize it in every state, so to speak. It's not as if by this bill passing, it means that cannabis is legal in Kansas or Texas or Tennessee or whatever. Instead, what it does is it removes it from the Controlled Substances Act and then allows each individual state to set their rules. So if Tennessee, for instance, wants to keep it illegal, Tennessee can keep it illegal. If
Okay,
Oklahoma,
let me jump in here for just a second then. Okay, so because I think this is important and this is what I'm picking up on. I know, and you haven't mentioned it yet, and I'd like you to. The tax they want, the wholesale tax, the wholesale tax that the federal government wants to add, which is where they replace the money I'm talking about, the 280E money. And because I just think it's necessary to point out that while the federal government isn't going to say it's legal everywhere, they're not going to try and step on any state's rights. They're going to leave it to the states, but they're going to say any state that does, here's the percentage we want. So I just wanted to point that out, but get into that, please, if you would. What is that percent? Tell us more.
Yeah, so it steps up year by year. It steps up year by year, so that in the first year, it's a 10% wholesale excise tax. And then it goes up to like 12.5 and then 15, and eventually gets up to 25% with the following qualifications. Small businesses only have to pay half of that tax rate.
Okay,
so
what is the level that they decide that cuts off for the small business?
$20 million, $20 million in cannabis product.
That's pretty good. That's pretty big. That's not huge because we're seeing cannabis is moving a lot of money, so that's not necessarily I don't know, Walmart or anything, but it's certainly stepping up there.
Yeah, and let me say something about the federal state issue, which is that every state is legally empowered to make something illegal in their state that's federally legal. Like kratom, for instance, is illegal in a couple states. Oklahoma, right, has a certain substance called tianeptine made illegal a couple of years ago that's legal around most of the country. So one way or another, right, individual states have the authority to ban, they could ban bubblegum if they want, right? And so the federal government can't mandate that a state legalize something, but by the federal government removing it, right, from the Controlled Substances Act, the social pressures will probably be enough to create some legalization in the states that are keeping it still illegal, be it medical or full access.
So I would have to wonder, again, thinking about the money, once you drop the shared screen for a second, so they can see us. What I would have to wonder then is in the states where they don't have it, if the federal government changes it and gets a take from the states that do legalize it, will the federal government still use the DEA to go after businesses or drugs in or marijuana, cannabis in those states where it's still legal? Will they still be looking for interstate trafficking, for example, that for the easiest example, because that would be the main reason they would be able to come into a state and look when it becomes interstate commerce?
My recollection is, so they list various agencies and the roles of those various agencies. And my recollection is that the DEA is removed from the equation. And so the ATF then might be in charge of any kind of unlawful trafficking. So there's the ATF, then there's like there's like an alcohol bureau.
A federal one you're talking
Treasury.
about?
Yeah.
Okay.
and the Treasury Department and so on. So there's 3 or 4 different agencies that be empowered to play this or that role with respect to it. So let's say, for instance, Kansas wants to keep on maintaining its illegality. Well, Kansas state law enforcement could always still do what they want to do, but there could still be some kind of federal agency involved as well, because there's, and we'll get into this, there's permit issues and there's other things that the federal government will introduce that will be relevant to interstate commerce.
Let me ask you again about the tax, because I think it's all about the money. And let's see, my screen, by the way, on the live feed, the playback is freezing. So please look for some questions and let me know if you see them, because they're not showing up on here and that one's frozen.
Yep.
But back to the money. Do you think that 25% is enough to offset what they're getting with the 280E? Because unless I'm mistaken, and maybe somebody out there in the business can help with this, isn't it, don't they currently under the 280E, if you can't find the right way to structure it, take as much as 70% in federal taxes? Isn't that the number we've heard?
Yeah, I think it's, yeah, 70% of the operate.
I know off the top of my head 2 businesses that have closed down in the last 12 months owing money because that they didn't know that when they set up, and so they're paying 70% on everything they did, and it's causing them to now be in debt with the federal government and lose their business.
Yeah, so the number that I saw was something in the order of something like $15 billion. Federal government is making about $15 billion a year out of the 280E, which is when you're looking at the federal revenue, that's a tiny amount, right? That's a drop in the bucket, right? You know, when you're talking about a $1 trillion budget, $15 billion is not a lot. And if they're looking at a 25% tax rate, and let's say the revenue goes up to, they're estimating it could go up to $50 billion, right? If cannabis is legalized, then that would be about $12 billion, $12.5 billion in federal taxes. So it's kind of in the same ballpark. So you're basically right that the 280E on the illegal trade is roughly on par with 25% of the legal trade.
Okay.
Ballpark, at least.
Okay. Now, and this is something a lot of people hate, but let's do some comparison. If you know any of this, it's just some questions I just thought of. How does that compare to, say, alcohol?
Yeah. So,
and wait, let me finish up by saying I know a lot of people are going to be mad. I even just mentioned alcohol and cannabis in the same sentence, but please understand, I'm trying to look at this from a position of the federal government and how they're going to regulate it. I'm not trying to make a moral judgment on one or the other or what they are.
Yeah. In fact, in that 30-page overview that the federal that I guess it's Chuck Schumer's office developed, they compare the taxation, the federal taxation through this act, to tobacco and to alcohol. And so they basically show that the tax rates, the percentage tax rates for alcohol and what they're planning for cannabis are in the same ballpark. Like for alcohol, it's a certain excise tax per gallon of beer or per gallon of spirits. And once you compare that to the retail value of those, it comes out about on par with what they're looking at as an ultimate 25% tax rate for cannabis. So there's excise taxes on cigarettes and excise taxes on alcohol. And so they're modeling it in the same way, an excise tax on cannabis. But let me add this, that one way that we need to think about this is that the model that the federal government is using for legalization is, what we often call rec or recreational, right? They're modeling it basically in a way that's analogous to alcohol and so on. This is something that people could take to enjoy themselves, not for the purposes of a medicine, right? It doesn't exclude medical use by any means, but the legislative model here, right, is paralleling it to alcohol. And what they do also in this act, I don't have it in my list really, but what they do also in this act is they want to expedite the research on cannabis for medical purposes. So this doesn't exclude cannabis medicine. This is basically saying we're going to just flat out legalize it. And then if businesses create medicines related to it, then those things could be introduced into the market through the FDA.
Okay.
And without the tax.
Okay. Well, let me remind everybody, because we've got about 20 people joining us, so we've got a few more than normal. Thank you everybody for joining us. Please share if you don't mind, so we can pass this around. If you're having any problems seeing it, like somewhere at the beginning, let me know. I keep checking to make sure it hasn't changed back the setting. For some reason, my Facebook has changed the setting. We take off with it set to see viewed by the public, and then it comes out private. And what we're talking about tonight is federal legalization and any changes they might make. And we're getting into some of the details of this proposed bill that the federal government has. So just a little recap of where we're at. So go ahead, Lawrence.
Yeah, let me go back to the screen share and go through a few more of those line items.
Okay, good idea.
So,
and again, if you guys have any questions, let us know. I see some comments. I'm reading comments when my playback unfreezes, and Lawrence is keeping an eye out for them. But if you have any questions or comments, please let us know.
All right, so I got, I think, to number 5, that it's still subject to each state's law. It's not going to override any individual state's laws. The federal government has trafficking penalties for amounts over 10 pounds. So amounts under 10 pounds won't be considered any kind of criminal trafficking. But if you are acting outside the scope of the law, both state and federal law, for amounts 10 pounds and over, then that could still be criminal.
So if you have 10 pounds and a joint, even though it's legal to drive through, say, Missouri, you're going to get in trouble unless you've got a business reason to be doing that. So
yeah, you know, if you have a business,
that is quite a bit, though. That is quite a bit. That is, I like to see those high numbers, not because I want to see everyone driving around with 10 pounds, but because I don't ever want to see, like you, ever see anybody putting handcuffs again over cannabis. So I like that number.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It also, even if there's a state that continues prohibition, let's say Kansas continues prohibition, and Oklahoma wanted to sell some cannabis to Nebraska or whatever, it will be lawful for the Oklahoma business to travel through Kansas to go to Nebraska. So a state that has made it illegal, they cannot, however, prohibit the transport of cannabis through that state. That's one.
Hey, I hate to back up again, but that's what I'm here for. Back to 6. The under 10 pounds, that's important, because one of the things we want to talk about tonight, and as we go through this, is how this might affect any state's efforts to move forward with cannabis petitions. States that are trying to, like we hope to do here in Oklahoma, hope to with full access before the federal government changes. And I bring this up because a conversation we have had, as well as many others have had, about how much do you make the personal limit, because we don't want the federal government to come in afterward and make it a lower amount. And if they're in this kind of ballpark, in the 10-pound ballpark, then that allows us to, I think, worry less about setting up a full access program where the federal government may change after we get it, and we have to cut down on how much we've made legal, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I like that number. That helps. We need to keep that in mind. Everybody needs to keep that in mind. There's a lot of people working on petitions. There's a lot of petitions being worked on. Everybody keep that in mind. I mean, we don't need to worry about making it 8 ounces, is what I'm saying, from a federal standpoint.
Yeah, there's a personal carve out. So there's a personal carve out to basically say that if you are growing and so on and so forth, personal use, you're not subject to the requirements for having any kind of permit and so on.
There's that in this. There's that personal carve out, and that is great because that means you can grow 10 pounds or just under 10 and take it to your processor halfway across the state legally and get it processed if that's what you need done.
Yeah.
You know, turn it into RSO or whatever.
Yeah, one thing I don't remember is whether or not that 10-pound restriction involves interstate transfer or intrastate transfer. I just don't remember, because if it is just intrastate, if it's within your own state, then that's just not going to be a big deal for an individual who's going to be traveling from one state to another with 10 pounds for personal use. You know,
again, I think where this is most helpful, that particular number, that 10 pounds is most helpful for anyone and everyone considering petitions. And when they're having that debate that we have often had about where we set the limit on full access, this says that to me that the federal government is not going to come in and slap you for that one.
Yeah. So, right. The federal government is not saying, talking at the level of ounces. Right.
Right.
And
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, one of the things that we were able to achieve in statute this year was to change the language for home grows, becomes effective in law November 1st. But as of November 1st, it will read that you will be legally allowed to possess the total amount of your harvest. If you have 6 mature plants and you harvest 6 pounds out of that, it will be lawful for you to possess it. And you possess 10 pounds of it, right? It'll be lawful for you to possess it.
Yeah. So let me tell you, November 1st is harvest day for me and thousands of people in Oklahoma. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. It's having a little fun. But
we have a question.
It will be nice. It will be nice not to worry that when you cut your plant down, that you're in trouble. It will be nice. And let me say this again. I've said this every time we brought this up. It's like a disclaimer. Other states that did this that we looked at required you to save part of the stock for a DNA test. So I guess if they kick in your door and you have 10 pounds, you can say, I grew it all. Look, here's the stock. This was managed to be slipped in quietly and without that restraint, but I suspect that they may come back with something like that down the road. So I just tell everybody, keep the stock, man. Keep 4 inches of what sticks out of the ground, or 2 inches and a little part of the root ball, or a tenth of that, something in a bag with your wherever you store it, and you're always legal. That's how it'll be. You'll always be legal. So you'll always be able to prove you grew that and you won't have to worry. So
and just to clarify, in there, the new law does not require that you preserve the root ball.
Right. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, this is my personal suggestion, because I that's how they do it in the other states that I saw that did it. And I think it was Oregon, but I don't remember. And you know, this was pulled off without that in there. So you know, but we need to be prepared. I expect it to come down the pike. So again, 6 is just extremely important for so many reasons. I had to come back to that. Go ahead. You were on 7.
Yeah, before we do so, there's a question from Deb Holden that says, when looking at complete tax benefits, it should be noted that alcohol kills 88,000 folks every year and tobacco takes out another 350,000, while the CDC lists deaths from cannabis at 0. The government is out a lot of money on alcohol and tobacco. Shouldn't that expense be deducted from revenues? So, so the expenses related to the costs for the deaths, shouldn't that be deducted from the revenues that are gained from the taxes? You know, I don't know how to.
That would be looking for a wash, and the federal government's not going to take a wash when they can make a profit. To simplify it, in my opinion,
Yeah, one way to, I think, get at her point is that there is a social cost to the legalization of tobacco and alcohol in the, you know, at the level of lives. There isn't that social cost for the legalization of cannabis. And so there's a reason to tax alcohol and tobacco that's not there for cannabis. And so there's the question as to the justification for the tax rate for cannabis. Well, as Chris points out, the justification is the federal government doesn't want to lose that 280E money. They want it back somehow. And this is the way to get it back.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure.
So record keeping, tracking rules, that's sort of just like, you know, businesses have to maintain records. There has to be some system for tracking products and so on. It's non-specific, but that there'll have to be some sort of rules.
Let's address, hang on just a second, pause there. Let's address that. We know that, or we believe that the things like metric or seed to sale came from an arrangement years ago with the first states that did this and the federal government, that they would stay out of they would allow them to do it and not get too involved if they could find a way to track it and keep it all in their state. You explained this to me before. What do you think about that and this issue?
So, yeah, so on the one hand, I support the idea of inventory tracking, that if you have to recall a product, if there's something wrong with it and so forth, you need a mechanism to figure out where it got shipped to, and informing the public to look at the lot number on your product to see if it's part of that. We have that with food recalls and so forth. So I think that's a great idea. But I think it's excessive and draconian to start tagging every plant.
But okay, but would you not agree that while this is a frame, this is just an outline, you know, the highlights, by the time that's worked out and works its way down to regulation, we're probably looking at required seed to sale or something like that in every state that the federal government works with on this? Or do you think?
See, I don't know. I think because the seed to sale system, right, where every plant is tagged, you know, that it's not in the consumer interest to tag every plant. The reason for tagging every plant is to basically do the DEA's job for them, right? The DEA doesn't want there to be diversion. So if you have seed to sale tracking, that creates basically a data chain that that's supposed to at least prevent diversion. Now, once we have federal legalization, then the need for preventing diversion is not as extreme, right? So I actually wonder whether or not seed to sale tracking will lighten up under federal, if there's a federal change. Like,
Okay.
does every tobacco plant, right? Does every tobacco plant in a tobacco farm in Kentucky have to be tracked? Is there a little RFID tag on every tobacco plant?
After descheduling or rescheduling, maybe tagging every plant isn't necessary, but still, again, some form of a good tracking system, something. Not nothing. We just don't know what else.
Yeah, not nothing, but like I said, I'm just not quite sure that it would have to be that extreme as the metric type system. The metric type system, as I see it, exists because of the legal disparities from one state to the next, and the existence of black market trade and so on. Which there still might be some black market trade if, say, Tennessee wants to keep it illegal, but it won't be anywhere near the same scale as the United States has had for generations because of federal prohibition.
Okay, let's work our way down your list, because
Yeah.
I've got one thing I'm going to mention it now before I forget. I know you'll remember when you're done with the list. Something we've talked about is, you think that the federal change will lower the cost drastically, and therefore, even though that there might be 25% wholesale tax added, that you think that you see the price coming down if the federal government changes. When we get to the bottom of this list, that's what I want to start addressing.
Yeah. All right.
Is the price and what you think it'll do versus what I was saying it might do.
So there'll be mechanisms to fund research, mechanisms to fund projects for communities adversely affected by the war on drugs.
So this is a lot of restorative justice stuff, right?
As explicitly called that, yes.
Okay, that's good. We like that. Not
Yep.
everybody does. We do.
Yep. It makes it clear that cannabis use is no longer a basis for denying immigration. So right now, you know, if you are applying for a green card or citizenship. You have to answer questions whether or not you use cannabis. You have to give a urine test, I think, for citizenship. And
Okay,
so,
but it doesn't mean that it's legal for you to be here illegally and carry cannabis. So people that are going to be on the other side of the immigration issue might not like that. That's a tricky one, but go ahead.
yeah, so if you're applying for immigration status, then it's not going to hurt your application if you use cannabis. Um, Cannabis can be recommended by the Veterans Administration. And then, of course, an important one gets rid of 280E, that business expenses will become tax deductible. It does introduce permits, federal permits for business, just like there is for tobacco and alcohol.
And do we have any idea, what, even a ballpark of what those license fees are?
I don't believe they were indicated in there. And if I recall correctly, there was a difference also between intrastate and interstate. So let's say, for instance, you're a business that only does business in Oklahoma. You may not be subject to the same federal permit requirements as a business that is transacting across state lines.
Okay.
And then, as mentioned already, wholesale excise tax will scale up eventually over, I think, a 5-year time frame to 25%, and small businesses will only have to pay half of that.
Okay, so let's take a look at the price. And again, if anybody has questions, ask. Lawrence, my screen's freezing again, so please, if you don't mind, keep up on the questions with us. I keep switching screens because that's how I get it to move again, but then I missed some of them. So if you could help out. But let's address that again. The price issue, something we have discussed, is the 280E tax and how it affects the cost at the counter versus the federal government changing and say, we'll compare it to this. Say this is their idea, even though we know these are just at this point dreams. Okay. So it may not work out this way, but they're ballparks that enough people agree on for it to get to paper. So if we use the numbers that we have with what we've just gone over versus the 280E, how do you see the price coming down over the counter for the customer?
Well, think about, there is no tax deduction for business expenses for growers, no tax deduction for business expenses for processors, no tax deduction for business expenses for dispensary owners currently, right? Okay. And so if something like, the only expense that they could deduct is the actual cost of the good. So whatever, if a dispensary is buying from a grow and the grow is charging X number of dollars, then that X dollars can be used as a deduction by the dispenser, but nothing else. They can't deduct their labor, they can't deduct their electricity, their utilities, and so on. So if 70% of the business expenses that otherwise could be deducted can't be deducted, then that's going to effectively get built into the price. And if there is one wholesale cost, one wholesale excise tax, right, versus every level of business not being able to deduct their business expenses, my guess is that 25% tax at the wholesale level will be something in the order of a quarter of the total amount of costs that are currently borne by businesses as a result of 280E.
Even those that might be set up in such a way that they can deduct most of their costs. Because, for example, when they have half the store is CBD, sometimes the address is actually legally split, and everybody works for the CBD store and things like that. So some of them have gotten creative, but let's be real about the numbers then. And most of the people out there, I think, know this, so I'm not shocking anybody, but the markup at dispensaries is 100%. Is that the markup at every other retail store? Because would this not be more of just a retail store then? I guess if I could see that number coming down, that 100% markup,
Yeah, I've heard much more than 100% in some cases.
I'm sure it could be. I think I don't know of many though. I would think it's more than that at the processor level, but not necessarily at the. I don't know many at the store level that high, but that's just straight across the board, 100% on everything. So maybe that could come down. I don't know. Let's ask the businesses out there and the people out there that might know. Would if you have a business, would you lower your percentage? I mean, we understand why you have to have 100% markup. We get that. We're talking about the 280E that's causing you to do that, or is that what's causing you to do that? Is that
And
necessary?
let me add this as another cost factor too. That once federal law changes, then think about what could happen with regards to health insurance, right? That potentially cannabis could become, right, a covered expense for health programs. And I actually discovered that there is one national health insurance company that does offer a cannabis program. So,
really?
Yep.
See, I'm surprised. Let me ask, because this is, I would say with this, and this is a bit of a side trail or rabbit hole, whatever. Would that be, does that work out with just synthetic cannabis, like
No.
synthetic THC, or is this working out with flower that they're buying, or
Yeah.
and is the where is the flower coming from? Is it coming from a dispensary, or is it coming from like the federal government grow, or I mean, is it coming from the store, whatever store you shop at?
Yeah. So there's a network.
Regular insurance.
Yeah, so there's a around, so this insurance is offered in all the rec states and most of the medical states. And that each of these states, there'll be a network, just like you have a network for your health insurance. There's a network of dispensaries that are part of that insurance. And if you have this insurance card, then there is a substantial reduction in the cost for your purchases. I forget the name of it. People could Google it. Health insurance for marijuana or something like that. Google it, and you'll probably find it. And oddly enough, the information there's a network here in Oklahoma, even though it lists Oklahoma as a state where THC is not legal, even though there's a network of dispensaries in here that are approved. So there's just something screwy about their website. Somebody got some information wrong. You got to look it up. But nevertheless, I was curious about it a few days ago, and I looked it up, and I found this one national company that provides insurance.
See, I find that as very difficult to get to catch on, because the inconsistency of the plant, and so the ability to purchase the same thing on a regular basis, unless it's edibles or something like that. But on flour and some other things, I just see that as difficult. So I would think the insurance would only be more inclined to go along with programs that use a synthetic THC and things like that.
Nope, it's called here Novus Cannabis Med Plan. I just Googled it. So I'm not endorsing it by any means. I don't know anything about the business other than what I glanced at. But I'm going to put it up on this thread here if anybody wants to do more research. Novus Cannabis Med Plan. And how good it is, I don't know. But it's nevertheless interesting that it is out there.
Michael on here is asking, what about the children? He's got a pretty long question there if you want to go over it real quick.
So, yeah, I think he said something about how legalization.
So, he's a physician down in Florida. I think you remember that. And he uses, so everybody knows, he uses cannabis as treatment in his own facility with some of his patients. He's been on the show before.
Yeah.
A few years ago. We should have him on again. It could be fun.
Yeah.
Michael, reach out. Let's do a show again.
Yeah.
All right. So you want to address what he said?
So he says one area where revenues can go is that it is never spoken about. How about using that revenue to subsidize bigger reimbursements for alcohol and for adult and child psychiatrists nationwide. Part of the reason why kids self-treat with cannabis is because of lack of access to psychiatric care. By doing that, you could blunt the inevitable prohibition complaints about what about the children. So, what about directing some of the revenue from these taxes to increasing reimbursements for psychiatric care? Well,
That'd be
we
great.
propose that.
Yeah, that would be great. That and building affordable housing nationwide and everything else.
Yeah, but bear in mind the tax revenues that we're looking at here would be something in the order of $12 billion, which at the national level is not that huge.
Okay, so and that's in the states that are legal now. In the existing programs, those are the rough numbers that are coming out.
No, what I read was, and this is in their information bulletin, they currently estimate something like $20 billion of total cannabis trade going on right now. And if it were legalized, then it would be about $50 billion.
Okay. But do they mean legalized everywhere? The rest of the states would only be another 30.
I don't think they were necessarily clear. If every state legalized versus if this bill passed, I don't remember if they were like saying, well, this doesn't even include Tennessee or something like that.
Right. That's what I'm wondering. Because, I mean, because you're saying it's only 20 billion.
Yeah,
Maybe it's not. Maybe because it would, if it passed, then maybe the other rest of the states would, do things, and then it might be.
The states that will hold back, the states will hold back and keep it prohibited, are going to be relatively small states, with the exception of Texas. Who knows what Texas will do?
So how do you think that all of this, because you were talking about the MORE Act at first, the bill that one passed the House, right? Is that what you said? I was sharing, but I was trying to listen. So that passed, and now we have this. So it's like I said, I'm starting to feel like it's about to happen. How do you think that affects petitions that are going on in every state, including our own state where we're trying to work on them ourselves, where everybody's doing it?
I think that there are some states where it'll just kind of add to the rationale. It's like if the federal government's ready to legalize it, then why shouldn't we, right? So, a state, for instance, like Georgia, for instance, right, that still is a prohibition state. I could see that argument going there, but that argument would apply here. But I think the other argument that would apply here is that Oklahoma envisions itself as an agricultural state, as potentially one of the major hubs of cannabis production in the country, right? And so if we did have interstate commerce, that Oklahoma is positioned to make a lot of money out of that. And the better position we are, if and when this happens federally, right, the better we will be at capitalizing on being kind of at the head of the line of other states. So yeah. What will it do? I think that it will just help drive petitions to success.
I think it's extremely important that we, as well as any other state that wants to get themselves ready or set up and profit from this, need to act quick. I mean, we looked at this before when we were looking at petitions last year. The amount of money that we could pull out of Texas, because as we see, none of these bills, none of these ideas coming out of the federal government are going to force states to do what they don't want to do. So if Texas wants to slow roll a program, or Kansas wants to slow roll a program, that gives us time to, of course, make a little money on the front side, but it gives us time to set up our state as a permanent hub for everything cannabis. It really does, medically and research and right. All the things we all care about.
Let me give you some examples
of all that.
Let me give you some examples. The way in which Texas wrote their cannabis legislation, they allow only 1% THC, but it was written in such a way that that's just like for anything, that the plant, that's the product. And so if you have a gummy that is um, 300 grams in weight, then you could have 3 grams of THC. If you have a gummy that is 3,000 grams in weight, then, or I should say milligrams, 3,000 milligrams is a big gummy, 3,000 milligrams, that's 3 grams, right? So if you have a 3-gram gummy, which is a pretty ordinary sized gummy, that means that you could have a 30 milligrams of THC, which is a relatively heavy dose. And so that's the Texas language. So that if we were allowed to have interstate commerce, then we could be selling, right, products like gummies and so forth to Texas. Kansas has an affirmative defense law that allows, I think it's either 5% or 7.5% THC, somewhere around there. And so we could be selling to Kansas. And so if interstate commerce were somehow made available, then there's all the revenue that we could garner from that. Never mind, right, Oklahoma, the costs for just the production of flower here might be substantially lower than the cost for production of flower in most of the country. So we could become one of the major exporters of cannabis flower for the rest of the country.
Yeah, so we could have all the grows we have now and not have a list of so many hundreds that are illegal.
Yeah.
That in itself, I think would help.
Right. It'll be much more like tomatoes, right? Because we can grow our tomatoes here and export them to another state without the tomato farm getting raided by the DEA.
Right.
So, or maybe the TDA, the Tomato Enforcement Agency, the DEA. So, so because there is no tomato enforcement agency, these tomato businesses can just get away with anything. And if we got cannabis out of the, from underneath the boot of the DEA, then these cannabis businesses could just operate like, any regular business and export to other states. It's just kind of insane. Isn't it insane? Isn't it just insane that here's a country with 38 states that have legalized cannabis, but states can't trade with one another? Isn't that just absurd?
I think it's just as absurd that the federal government collects a 280E tax on something they've declared illegal. That is it's so hypocritical, and I hate hypocrisy, and I'm a hypocrite. We're all hypocrites to some degree, but hypocrisy drives me nuts, and that's hypocrisy.
Right. Oh yeah, so they've declared it illegal, but they don't enforce it, and they're going to charge you all that tax on it.
Right. So they declared it illegal solely and only so they can collect that amount of money. That's why I've been saying I don't see any movement forward until they can make it where there's either a slight increase in what they make now, or at the very least stay even, and I'm sure the DEA and others with big budgets that increase every year are fighting this tooth and nail.
Right. So I think that well, bear in mind the DEA is prohibited from using any of its dollars, right, to interdict cannabis in any state that's legalized it. So basically, those dollars, what they do with that money now? You know what the DEA does with all the money they're not allowed to use for cannabis prohibition anymore?
What?
They raid pain management doctor offices with it.
Okay, well, Jim Inhofe just asked for $4 million to raid cannabis farms in Oklahoma, so they're gonna find a way to get around that law of not using any money.
Orwell. It's completely George Orwell, right? And this is the endless war. We've always been at war with Eurasia. No, we've always been at war with Oceania, right? If it's not one thing, it's another, but we always have to be at war. And so if they're not allowed to engage in acts of war against cannabis, they have to find something else to engage in acts of war against. And so that's pain management, right? That's the war culture of the DEA.
That is the mess we have going. That is what we need. That is what we need to change, the big picture. So to be more specific, how do you see to get pretty specific, or we'll keep it general, and some conversations you've either been in or know about in working petitions in this state, do you see any major conflicts in what the ideas the federal government's also pushing forward? And like I pointed out in the one conversation you and I frequently have about the limit to allow someone to carry. Do you see a lot of change in what they're doing and how it affects, say, the petition that Orca is working on, without getting too specific?
Well, there was discussion in Orca about trying to make sure that the petitions are more amenable to any changes in federal law. So in Oregon, for instance, there's a law in Oregon that says not only if federal law changes will we be allowed to transact cannabis across state lines, but Oregon has a law that says either upon a change in federal law or if the Department of Justice issues a memorandum stating that they will not prosecute interstate commerce, then Oregon can engage in interstate commerce. So it's like the Cole memo. The next step for the Cole memo is, look, we're not going to engage in interdiction between two states that have legalized. If we get
So what you're saying is Oregon's ready for that.
Oregon's ready for that. That's right.
We need to be ready for that.
That's right. So that's in discussion right now with Orca. Okay. And so we'll see how it plays out. But
I know Jed, when he was on, he talked about his desire to see, I was asking about his desire to see cannabis or medical marijuana or marijuana and hemp under the same agency. And that I see as part of this, you know, how we set ourselves up. I don't know whether that's good or bad. That's up to the businesses. I'd like someone to explain it to me a little better, but it looks good, I think. And that could again set us up to be ready for more interstate commerce if we don't get tangled in the weeds of the THC percentage. You know, beyond what's reasonable, I guess.
So that's right. That I think that anyone working on a petition, not just Orca, but anyone out there working on a petition, it would obviously be a smart move to design those petitions in such a way to maximize Oklahoma's potential upon any change in federal law. So like right off from the gate.
Isn't there about a half a dozen states working on petitions now that we've heard about public?
So, you know, there's been a lot of states that have legislatively legalized this year through New England, right?
Yeah.
You know, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and so on.
Oh, and I want to say New York, their limit is like 5 pounds, I think, isn't it? I'm pretty sure I'm correct.
Something like that, yeah.
So they got that. They did good there. That's a win for New York in my mind, because so many less people are going to get put in handcuffs.
So let me think. Rhode Island, I think Maryland, Oregon, Delaware, those 4 states are looking at legislative legalization. So we're up to 19 states that have legalized full access. Those 4 more states might legalize this year legislatively. In Mississippi, their system is all screwed because, you know, basically there was a state Supreme Court judgment that overrode their initiative, and they're looking at a special session in their legislature to do something about it. You know, I'm just thinking by the end of this year, we'll probably see 22, 23 full access states.
Do you know the details of the Missouri one that was overridden? What I mean is, I know they ran like 3 or 5 petitions that year. It sounds like rain outside or something. Anyway, sorry. Out of the petitions they ran, do you know which one it was and who ran it? I'm just curious as to, because I know like New Approach ran one up there, and I'm curious as to, you know, what was wrong with it. If one of their courts was able to, I mean, again, if our state's going to work on petitions, everybody needs to know the dangers out there and what went wrong in other states, see if we can avoid them. So I'm just curious if you happen to know that one.
I don't, there were like 3 or 4 of them in Missouri, and whichever one got the greatest number of votes did win, but I just don't remember which that was.
Okay.
Pardon me?
I knew that the one that got the most number of votes won.
Yeah. you know, but you know, it's a weird thing because if both of them get over 50%, which becomes law, right? So that's sort of right. So Mississippi, what happened in Mississippi's case was that the language for initiative petitions required like a certain number of signatures out of each of the 5 congressional districts. But Mississippi went from 5 congressional districts down to 4 congressional districts. And that then resulted in a technical violation of the constitutional provisions for initiative petitions, nullifying the Mississippi petition. That's what happened there.
And I want to remind everybody that we had what originally 11, but I think like 4 ideas that got to committee that would have changed the petition process in this state, none of which got out of committee, but got to committee. It's not that hard to get something to committee, but still, everybody needs to be aware that is something they're going to try every year. That's And I want to bring up something Representative Scott Fetgater said one time. I think, I'm sure you've heard him say this, that this year he voted on more alcohol bills than anything, or since he's been in a legislator, and prohibition's been over for, almost 100 years. So we're, our cannabis laws are changing constantly here, and going to be if we don't do something.
Well, they'll change, some might be good, some might be bad, but, the idea is that there's a lot of detail to work out. And I just think that the legislature has the opportunity, they had it last year and they'll have it again this coming year, to themselves introduce full access. Because my overall perspective is nobody should go to jail. Nobody should have their lives harmed. Nobody should get a criminal offense for cannabis. But despite 788, between 4,000 and 6,000 people each year continue to get misdemeanor charges for cannabis possession. And a misdemeanor charge could mean when somebody does a background check, you don't get a loan, you don't get your rental apartment, you don't get your job.
And unless I'm mistaken, and we don't have to bring up any names right now because I'm not sure they've gone public with it, but or maybe they have, that there's some senators or House members that have called for different studies, interim studies, this during this break about those sorts of issues that are thinking about possibly presenting full access bills next year, right? Is there much you can tell on that end?
There's about 4 or 5. Yeah, there's about 4 or 5 interim study requests filed. I don't think there's been any official decisions on them. I've met with a couple of the legislators who have proposed them. I don't recall any that's specific to the issue of full access and decriminalization. But I did have this productive conversation with Representative Marty during the session, where he was supporting decriminalization, and he asked me to gather some data for him to present to the governor, because the governor is the one that's holding us back. And so he asked me to look into how many states have decriminalized, whether decriminalization took place with medical, whether it preceded medical, because in some states, decriminalization goes all the way back to the 1970s, right? And all the decriminalization means is that simple possession is a fine versus a criminal charge, right? You still get in trouble, but you don't get a criminal offense for it.
Right. It doesn't necessarily mean it's okay, but you're not going to go to jail.
Right. All the decriminalization means is that you're not going to be committing a criminal offense through simple possession, but that doesn't mean that it's legal, right? So Nebraska, just for instance, has had decriminalization since the 1970s, but there's no cannabis program there, right? It's just that simple possession is a fine, usually your first or your second or your third offense, and then it becomes criminal. And so I got a whole bunch of data for him and I sent it to him, and he wanted to have a conversation with the governor about it. So maybe next year, if nothing else pans out, maybe next year we can decriminalize simple possession here in Oklahoma.
Well, I bet that there'll be more than one petition that makes it to the ballot, which I think will be, will be very odd for Oklahoma. But I really see that happening because I believe there's probably so many different groups that
Yeah.
are are trying different ideas and have all have good ideas, and I'm looking forward to signing them all. So maybe everybody will, and then we'll have a bunch of choices when it comes election day, and we can
Yeah,
pick.
now won't that be fun, to have like, roundtable discussions and town hall meetings where each of the proponents for the various petitions comes up and talks about the merits of their petition. And then voters could decide whether they like petition A or B or C the most.
No, I mean, I'd like to see them all get the signatures,
Yeah,
everybody's, so
Yeah.
we can all vote at the polls. So then the whole state can decide.
yeah,
Stand up anyway, and that gives us more choices. And any of those that aren't in the community
right.
that might not be a part of that would still get a say in which particular, not just yes or no, but which particular. I love the idea of the multi
Yeah,
choices.
yeah. What I'm saying in like September or October, if it's going to be voted on in November, I'm saying like in September or October, have like town hall meetings where each of the
Right before the
proponents.
vote. Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, that would be a lot of fun. I look forward to it.
Well, let me see, any questions from anyone who's, anyone still have any questions that we can address? I think we're planning on doing this weekly for a while, so we'll
Yeah.
have something new coming up.
And as they can see, we'll find something to talk about. Well, this has been an interesting conversation. I've appreciated it. I've learned some. I like to have the open discussion with everybody about, what we actually think about what might happen and get their input. So it's been good. Debbie, you've had some good questions. Everybody's had some good comments. I think we're going to wrap it up. You want to add anything else before we wrap it up?
I'm just seeing here, there's something related to McGirt. Given the recent McGirt decision, what prevents the Oklahoma tribes to decriminalize cannabis and regulate it within their jurisdiction? Good question. I do not know federal law with regards to native tribes. They're subject to federal law, but I just don't know what kind of autonomy they have in contrast to the state autonomy. So it might be that a tribe could do whatever they want with regards to cannabis, just like a state can. That the supremacy clause with regards to states means that we can't force anybody to break a federal law, but we can, as a state, still say that we're not going to abide by federal law. We're going to carve out something that says we're not going to enforce federal law. And that's why we're able to legalize cannabis despite supremacy. Does this apply to the tribes? I just don't know. I don't have an answer.
I saw an opinion the other day, a legal opinion. I don't remember who it was, somebody working for the state. And it gave me the impression, it implied that this decision was much more narrow than some people are thinking, and that they can't do much more beyond these some criminal charges. So that may or may not affect a legal business, especially if it changes to full access. That's a good legal question there. We need some legal minds to fill us in on that. Maybe a lawyer who knows some tribal law. But again, the what I heard the other day was kind of the opposite, that it was pretty narrow. So
I think in the decision, because of what was at issue in that Supreme Court decision in McGirt, because of what was at issue in the Supreme Court decision, it only pertains to the criminal process with regards to natives within McGirt land. It doesn't apply to anything else, that decision. But then the question is, in light of that decision, what might happen next?
So that could be precedent that changes the whole ball game. So we don't know. We just don't know that one.
Yep.
Okay, well, I think we're going to wrap it up. You good with that?
Yep.
It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. All
right, Lawrence, you stay there. Folks, we appreciate you watching. We're down to, on my count here, is 10 people. Thank you, all of you, every one of you, for sharing. And for commenting. We really appreciate it. Like Lawrence said, we'll try and do this every Sunday. Sorry we didn't do it at 6. I got home late. And last week we did 2 shows, but sometimes that's going to happen when we can get the right person on. And last week it was Mark. I thought that was a really good show. If you haven't seen that, go back and watch that. I kind of like pitting Lawrence and Mark Woodward from the OBNDD against each other. It's kind of fun, and just sit back and watch. But anyway, thank you all for watching. We will come back again next Sunday. And until then, stay grumpy. I'll see you on the road.